Aquatic biomes, my favorite. As we go through aquatic biomes, you should be able to identify the major freshwater biomes and the major marine biomes. So, as you can imagine, marine biomes have a very high salinity level. They actually come in, it's not just the ocean. We can have salt marshes, the mangrove swamps of South America. There's intertidal zone areas that can sometimes even be separated from the ocean. Coral reefs, of course, and then the open ocean. Kind of reminds me of Finding Dory, the open ocean exhibit. I'll never forget that. I was like, hey, that's a biome. So, like freshwater marshes, saltwater marshes are found along the coast, and they're usually in pretty temperate climates, and they contain some emergent vegetation. A salt marsh is one of the most productive biomes in the world, and we have a lot of estuaries out of these salt marshes. Savannah, Georgia is a huge salt marsh all along the coast there. Many salt marshes are found along areas where the freshwater river actually mixes with salt before it hits the ocean. So because rivers carry these large amounts of nutrients and organic material down with them towards the ocean, estuaries are extremely productive places for plants and algae and anything to grow. Salt marshes also, they provide important habitats for fish so that they can spawn. Even shellfish rely a lot on these estuaries. About 2/3 of all the marine fish and shellfish actually spend a part of their life cycle, usually a larval stage, in an estuary. So when I was in school, we would call them nurseries. The mangrove swamp is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful, and it occurs along the tropical and subtropical coast, usually in South America. If you can imagine the Panama, Costa Rica areas, those are a lot of mangrove swamps there. And usually these guys here have trees whose roots are submerged all the way into the water. And most of these trees, called mangroves, are salt tolerant. They actually have specialized cells that kick out the salt that's in the surrounding water. They often grow in an estuary type of environment, but they can also be found along the coastlines. And these trees, these special mangrove trees, they help to protect coastlines from being eroded from storm damage. They also produce leaves. So these falling, when their leaves fall, a lot of organic matter is trapped inside of them because the trees have specialized cells that have moved material to their leaves. And when those leaves fall, they are very nutrient rich. And so this creates a very productive environment. So like salt marshes, mangrove swamps provide a lot of shelter and habitat for fish and shellfish. Intertidal zones are one of my favorite to visit. These are usually like narrow band of coastlines that exist somewhere between the high tide and low tide area. That's why it's called intertidal. And usually they're pretty steep and rocky. Sometimes they're even extremely muddy. Coral reefs are found in these warm, shallow waters that are very close next to the shoreline. They represent Earth's most diverse marine biome. Corals are these tiny little animals that secrete a layer of limestone or calcium carbonate, and that forms their external skeleton. Coral animals they belong to a family called cnidarians, kind of the same phyla as jellyfish. The animal that's living inside of this little tiny skeleton is essentially a hollow tube with tentacles, and plankton swim by, and the animal comes out, grabs plankton and floating detritus, and that's what it eats. Corals live in water that is relatively poor in nutrients for the most part and food, which is possible because of their relationship with this other single-celled algae we call zooxanthellae. The algae lives within inside of the tissues of the coral, and when the coral digests food, it releases carbon dioxide. That algae use that carbon dioxide that the animal releases to go through photosynthesis and produce sugars and nutrients which stimulate the algae um, to release their sugars. And then the algae obtain the carbon dioxide and nutrients. So a safe place to live within inside of the corals are this tiny limestone skeleton. But this association with photosynthesis and algae means that the coral can only live in shallow waters where light can get to them.
Mom?
As individual corals die and they decompose, their limestone skeleton stays there. And so over time, their skeletons accumulate and develop on top of each other and on top of each other. And eventually they can become quite massive, like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which is 1,600 square miles. It's a tremendous diverse community, and it includes a lot of fish and invertebrates, and it's also a lot of, refuge for other organisms. Coral reefs are currently facing this wide range of challenges, usually pollution and sedimentation from runoff. Corals also face this growing condition which is called bleaching. It's a phenomenon where this algae, the zooxanthellae that live inside of the coral, they basically die. And without the algae, the coral also soon die. And the reef turns white because the algae, remember, is what gives the coral their color. So scientists believe that the algae are dying from a combination of a lot of disease in the environment and the environment changing. Like when the ocean pH is lowered and at normally high water temperatures, that's usually when coral bleaching becomes the most serious problem. But without corals, the entire coral reef biome is pretty much endangered or gone. The open ocean contains deep water that is located miles away from shore, and sunlight can no longer reach the bottom there. The exact depth that penetrates by sunlight really depends on a number of different factors, like how much sediment's there, how much algae suspended in the water, but usually it doesn't, exceed 200 meters or 650 feet. So like a pond or a lake, the ocean is divided into two zones. These zones are in the next diagram here, but they're basically called the Photic Zone and the Aphotic Zone. So the Photic Zone is where photosynthesis takes place, and then the much deeper layer where light cannot penetrate is the Aphotic Zone. The ocean floor is also called the benthic zone. So in the Photic Zone, algae are the major producers. And, they form the basis of the food web that include these tiny zooplankton, fish, and whales. And in the aphotic zone, because of the lack of sunlight, there's no photosynthetic processes going on there. But there are some small species, or some species of bacteria that use energy that's contained within the bonds of methane and hydrogen sulfide, and they are both found in the deep ocean. And they generate their own energy via this process called chemosynthesis. It's kind of their process rather than using photosynthesis, where they generate energy. And these bacteria basically form the foundation of the deep ocean food web. And, there's lots of other small animals and tube worms. The aphotic zone also contains a variety of organisms, and some of them can even generate their own light in dark waters. Organisms like crustaceans, jellyfish, squid, it's quite fascinating. So if we're looking at a diagram here of the open ocean, you can separate it into these very distinct zones. We do have the intertidal zone, which is defined by high and low tide, the photic zone, where light penetrates, and then the aphotic zone, where sunlight is absent, and then of course the benthic region, which is the muddy layer that contains a lot of organism life.